checking in with the Business Not As Usual podcast with your hosts, Vince and Mike. And now, on with the show. Welcome to this episode of the Business Not As Usual podcast. It's just Vince for a minute. Giving a little bit of context to this episode with where Mike and I interview the amazing Lori Silverman. So we like to have a little chat, whether it's just the two of us or we've got a guest on, we like to have a little chat in advance of the episode just to talk about stuff. And we started having that conversation with Lori, and she was on from the minute we started chatting, and we both were sort of talking back and forth in messaging like we've got to start recording this. We haven't started the episode, but it is time to just hit record and let the value flow. And so you're gonna see a very awkward start because we just hit record. But listen to this extra long episode of the podcast because Lori from start to finish is just on fire. So hope you enjoy. And we didn't get a chance to say it at the end of the episode, but we love to hear from you what value you're getting from this podcast, and what do you want us to talk about. So you can always hit us up at michaelmartino.ca or vincentmirabelli.com. We want to hear from you, and on with the show.
What you need to do then is that you need to say, we just recorded this, Lori, so it's not like you could hear it. So.
Well, I mean, literally. So what we were talking about was how to navigate transformation during and maintain your business as usual, and it's one of the things that Mike and I sort of disagree on, in that he takes one perspective of leveraging service design to ensure that everyone's aligned on.
Are you pressed and record?
Oh, record is done. Yeah.
Okay.
We're recording now.
Because this is gold, and we're not recording.
No. I hit record. So, and I said you need a person who is an enterprise analyst. So I actually made the statement that not enough BAs serve in that enterprise role that are aligning all the different pieces of the business, either as you're going through a transformation or as just, ensuring that projects don't conflict. Because how often does the left hand not know what the right hand is doing within an organization? So if you have that one person who's an enterprise true business analyst operating at strategic enterprise level, then you can have that alignment and ensure that you're doing the right things. So yes, so we'll have to that's for us to figure out how to sequence, but I think there's a natural sequence here, and whether this goes first or that one goes first, it's going to be good stuff. So
well, you're missing a word in that, and that is alignment and integration. It's not enough to align. You have to align it. And I tell people that I still remember back to a meeting I had when I was 30 years old, or maybe 33 years old, with the chairman of Chevron and his top 52 executives. And he wanted to do a 52 business unit transformation. And I was working in a couple of the businesses and we were wildly successful, my team and I.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was presenting to him, he was maybe about 10, 15 feet away from me. He was right directly in front as I was standing. And he stopped me in mid-sentence and he said, "Miss Silverman, I just got my aha." He said, "Everything we're trying to do is an add-on to the business. We need to shift the way we do business. We need to move from add-on to shifting." And I looked at him and I said, that's alignment and integration. Because if you have fabric like cotton and wool, you don't just align the different types of fibers, you integrate them together. If you say you have a cotton and wool sweater, unless you're talking about one arm being cotton and one arm being wool.
Right.
And that integration piece just stayed with him. And he said, "We're approaching this all wrong." And I said, "Well, I wouldn't say it's all wrong. It's just that we need to do some things that are different." And because my background is, in organization development and also strategy, And I know how to do, I know how to map processes. I know how to elicit requirements, because as an OD expert, you have to learn to do those things as
For
well.
sure.
It's just from a different perspective. It made a world of difference. But we always, when we did transformation with my team, I always said to them, we have to do a change impact assessment up front. And that change impact assessment has as a part of it, and this is going to sound very, I would say that technical in a way, human technical term, but we knew how to do what's called organizational architecture assessments. And that was a part of a change impact assessment. And so we would do that for everyone. And today you can't get companies to want to do that because they think it's going to take 6 months or 12 months like a McKinsey or a Deloitte. And the answer is, I've done it in a tech group in 2 days with a group of 20 people around a table. This is not rocket science. And we have to be agile. And what we've just learned is that you can do these change impact assessments with the OA component. And if you align your agenda, up front to do it quickly, you just make it organic and iterative, and you add to what you learn along the way. You have some really successful transformations.
That is great stuff. And I think all that stuff that we just talked about, we're going to leave in the episode. So we'll have to figure out how to intro that, but that was gold.
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about at BBC.
Oh, okay. Well,
November.
And let's.
And I want to talk about that. There's a much larger role for BAs to play. That's exactly this. I don't think it's a single person. I believe that everyone who has a BA role has to be able to be a chameleon. They have to be able to flex into a more strategic capacity, and they have to be able to flex at the front line into a more operational or tactical capacity. And that's what makes you good. There's a wonderful video I show my graduate students. I'm teaching strategic thinking this term, and it's on ambidexterity. And ambidexterity is the ability of a business, and this is at the enterprise competence level, to not only pay attention to the current, but also do foresight work and pay attention to the future. And I think that that's the identical thing that we have to be able to do as human beings. And everyone has the capacity to do this within us. It's not like our brains are wired one way or another, although we have a predisposition, right? Mm-hmm. Myers-Briggs temperament predisposes us. I'm predisposed to be a futurist. I love to think about the future, but you can put me in the present moment and I can work you through a problem, and I can do it very tactically. But that flexing, I think, is a skill set that I would love for every BA to develop, and to move away from after they obtain some technical skills, like new technical skills, like being able to do data analytics, or if I'm not familiar with Agile, knowing something about Agile, because I think it's important to know what I call a just enough, on a just enough basis, all of these different tools and techniques, but the one that is most necessary is, how do I shift this business? Mm-hmm. And how do I make my C-suite leaders and the business wildly successful? So this is being in service to the enterprise as a whole.
And if the enterprise is already go ahead, Vince.
I wanted to do the intro to the episode, because that's the point of welcome to the Business Not As Usual podcast. I'm Vince. We've got Mike, and we've heard from our guest, because we just hit record, because there was some gold and we didn't want to lose it. Welcome to the episode, Miss Lori Silverman. Lori, thank you very much. And you've already given us more than we were expecting, but let's
just keep going.
Let's keep going.
Do you think we're done?
Let's just keep going.
No. Mike, you were going to ask something. I just wanted to make a formal intro. Mike, you're up.
Yes. All right. So, yes. So, before the intro, if we go back to, you had talked about the first thing you should do before you even start a transformation are all those things that you talked about. So let's say that the organization didn't do that at all, and then they call you, and let's say, they've been they're planning, the transformation's already rolling. So would you go in and do the same thing, or would you use a different tactic to try and try and stop the momentum so you can get in there and do the work that you need to do?
Well, I'm a both and sort of girl, so it's a both and situation for me, quite frankly. You don't want to ever stop the momentum. On the other hand, you need to quickly integrate these other pieces. And so I only get called when there's failure. I'd like to get called before something starts, but the reason people call me up is because we're stuck, and we need some assistance. And I love those situations because I love messy, complex scenarios. And so the first thing we have to do is say, well, which pieces do you have in place? First of all, do you have this stakeholder assessment? And by the way, when you do it for one transformation, it's transferable. You just have to shift some of the columns. So if you have a column on a scale of 1 to 5, or I use a commitment ladder, some words in those, what's this person's level of commitment to this particular project? What are they willing to give and what do they need from it? That might shift for every transformation. But if you're putting down, what is that person's personality temperament so I know how to approach them? Or, what projects have they been part of in the past where it's been successful or unsuccessful? I ask that anyways because I did a project back in 2011 where we could not find one successful transformation in the history of the people who were there during the transformation that we had embarked on.
Tremendous.
And we went to everybody and talked to them. And this was we did this even after we had done a whole bunch of other things. I had this epiphany one day. I said to my program manager, because I was one of 5 project managers, and I said, do we know if there's ever been a change that's been successful? I said, you're fairly new to this organization. You've been here 2-3 years. You're new to this part of the organization. And she said, that's a really good question. Let's call up a couple people. There's usually co-leaders to these massive programs. And let's meet with them. Not a one. But what we did learn was some really golden nuggets when we interviewed them about specific things that did work. And specific ways to approach specific people or teams or different scenarios. And that was gold. And I said, that's part of our knowledge repository. This is not going away because nobody else in the enterprise has done it. So that you're going to keep. You're going to keep these stakeholder assessments that are around transformation. But for me, I think the bigger issue has to do with, have you taken your change and teased it into 4 different types of change? And I'll give you an example of what I mean when I say this. So I use Linda Ackerman Anderson's model, which looks at developmental change, which is what do people need to learn along the way. Transitional change, which is we're not bringing in something that's totally new. We're just replacing something that is with something that's different. So maybe we have a procedure, but it's going to get updated. Okay, so that might be an example. Or a piece of equipment's going to change out. And then there's the transformational piece. And there's 2 types of transformation they talk about. Conscious transformation, which is the leader saying, we are going to do this. And reactive transformation, welcome coronavirus. Right? That's a reactive. So we're having to do a lot of different things as a result of that. Or it could be, hey, there was a fire at our major supplier in Japan because they had a tsunami hit their plant and we don't have any backup suppliers. So we're not going to be in business with raw material for 6 weeks. And I have examples of these happening. And there's been no contingency plan put in. But and I have a 4th type of change I add, which is perpetual change to that, because people forget that you're not done. This is not a program. This is a journey, and this is an organizational journey. And all of these different transformations at any one point in time are additive. And somebody's got to be managing the complexities and the relationships between them, not just the one we're working on. What is it butting up against? And how might another change in another part of the organization be influencing us, positive or negative? Or how might we complement them? And that, to me, that's why this role is needed.
So that's exactly what we talked about last night, Vince.
Oh, you mean in the next episode?
Or, yeah, we've talked about that.
Depending on how we sequence it.
In a prior, future, or present episode,
yes,
we talked about how do you keep the transformation going while the business needs to continuously improve? And then how do you, when you're continuously improve, not change the trajectory of the transformation? Because it could happen if they go in a completely different direction if there's no alignment. So you're saying that there's this group or a set of, or one person or a set of people that need to constantly be checking those change impacts from whatever is going on in the business.
Yeah, we assign people on the stakeholder matrix. Like if I have a team of people I'm working with, somebody's assigned to each stakeholder to be the go-between for communications of stuff like this.
Right.
So that we are, and that's our person too, that if we do something that we think might upset that initiative, that we're saying, you got to go talk, to these 2 or 3 people that you're assigned to. Well, and that really makes the difference.
And that's where I'm buying deeper into your statement about, BAs being perfectly situated for this, because they're doing that anyway, but they're doing it on a micro scale. So they're doing it on a project or on an initiative, and really all this person or this team or whatever would be doing is doing it on a more of a macro scale. So they're looking at still individuals, but it's more of a strategic view, an enterprise view versus a project view.
Well, you have to always remember that there are multiple levels of change going on anytime there's a transformation.
For sure.
The challenge is that most of us only know how to do individual change. My original background, because I'm a former therapist, so I know how to do change in a therapeutic setting, which today we call executive coaching. Not much different. Right? Yeah, exactly. But what I learned along the way that I'm so blessed to have gained was how do you do enterprise level change? And that cannot be done individual by individual.
Right.
There are a body of tools and techniques to shift organizations. I've worked in places as large as 1 million people being the only consultant, and we have made huge shifts happen. And you can make them happen. I had someone in a LinkedIn Live show that I did a couple of weeks ago. I was saying to my guest, Michael Leckie, and we were talking about a new role for digital transformation or data transformation, what he calls the expirational leader. And I say the same thing to BAs. These roles are not necessarily permanent roles. If you are inserted in, they're roles that come and go, and they shift and they change, and you have to know that you're coming in to perform these enterprise level activities, and then you're setting up the infrastructure for the change to maintain itself. And then you may be going on, but so there's a role within a role, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I was on for that episode, and I loved that idea because it ensures that the person who's there is made senior enough that they can have impact, but ensures that they also have skin in they're invested in the change.
Right.
Right. Like they have an impetus to grow or to see that change through, as opposed to a consultant that either will string that change along to add billable hours, or at the end of the day can walk away and well, it didn't work, on to the next one. So, they're almost staking their reputation on being able to drive that change, whatever it may be.
Well, I think that there is a role for a consultant, because I first learned this role as a consultant. But it's a partnership.
Right.
Because what I said to Michael, and I don't think we said it on the show, was I think this is a duality role, meaning there's an internal and an external. You don't have all the knowledge that you need to necessarily do it internally, and you have political pressures on you internally that an external doesn't have.
Correct.
And
right.
I can pull some fast ones with some business leaders behind the scenes, and they might actually listen, but they wouldn't listen to you if you're internal. It doesn't mean that we both can't do the work, but there's a different capacity and a different credibility and a different, I bring a different skill set because I know the organizational piece. But when I've partnered, like I did in 2011, oh my gosh, you can accelerate. That's what people say, well, change can't be agile. Transformation can be agile. You just have to have an enterprise change agent working with you. on this. Because if you have, and it's sad for me to say this, you may feel differently, but if you have ProSci certification, which is lovely, that's more focused at the level of the individual.
And
It's not the enterprise tools and techniques. You're not going to learn about how to do real-time strategic change techniques or whole systems change techniques where you can bring a couple hundred people together in a room. You're not going to know how to shift on a dime in a single day's meeting, because we can bring in some articles about the future, look at some scenarios, and then back out from those what we need to do different. You might not know those, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, but when you partner with an external, the whole goal should be to learn from that person so that your skill set's developing. But it's always good to have kind of that yin and yang piece. So that's where I think Michael and I have a little bit of a difference. He's played that role internal. I've always played it, well, external. I can't say I always have, because early on in my career, I said this on a podcast for Data Able. I talked about analytics adoption. I have several instances when I was internal early on and had no power, had no authority, and I still was the instigator for transformation. I actually brought in the transformations and I got them off the ground. And it's possible. So I don't want people to leave here thinking, oh, if I don't have a particular job title or level of authority in the organization, I can't do anything. The answer is you can do anything you want as long as you're stealth.
All right. So I want to ask a question, but I don't know if I can. So I fully co-sign everything you just said. I have tried to bring that, to be that agent of change, that disruptor, that pain in the ass. But it's difficult in some environments. Is that because I wasn't stealth enough? Or is it that there are some environments that are highly bureaucratic and are better equipped to resist any sort of transformation?
Well, I worked in government. I mean,
I'm not talking about
military.
government. I'm just you know,
I'm thinking military organizations here, okay? I've worked in military. I've worked in higher education. Those are all bureaucratic government.
Yes, they are. Okay.
I want to give you a third option.
Okay.
Stop being the pain.
I was going to say that.
Stop being the pain and start being wildly likable.
Stop being the pain in the ass. Yes.
Yes. And because likability is the number one influence skill. Number one. And likable people pull stories out of others. Likable people tell someone's story back to them. Likable people listen. Likable people, and I did not know this early in my career. I can now say, there's a lot of like water over the dam, right? But today, I really do believe in treating everyone with loving kindness. And even those people that I say to myself, you are doing your best and you probably should not come to work today because you're doing your best and your best is going against us. I still have loving kindness for. And that shift in me made a shift in my ability to do good work.
I noticed that as well, and hopefully, Mike, you've noticed that as well. That I do make more of an effort. Like, there was a time where I wanted to bring change by kicking down the door and just shoving it in people's face, and this is what's going to happen, and you're going to like it. I'm much more, I would say, strategic in my approach now. But you mentioned story there, Lori, and that was what we wanted to talk about. But I didn't want to stop that flow. How would you then leverage story to bring about transformation? How would you construct and deliver story so that it is meaningful and impactful and starts the organization down that road of transforming?
Well, I think that we have to, excuse me for a second. I think that we have to broaden the scope. It's not just the stories that you say, it's more about the stories you provoke.
And what do you mean by
other
that?
People.
What do you mean?
So I'll give you a couple examples. So let's say that I have a change, and I'll use this, and I'll go back to the types of change example. So I was brought in to a very large credit union system a number of years ago to help with a core processing system change. The man who was heading up the project had 6 months locked off his very detailed project plan, and the original didn't even include everything. So you can imagine what that was like for him and how we're going to get this done. And the organization had mandated that this entire initiative would show results by year 5.
Mm-hmm.
So he and I and the CEO and the COO, who was his boss, sat down one day. And this was one of my first meetings. And I chatted with the CEO, and I used a variety of story prompts. Story prompts are phrases that start with the words, tell me about. It's not tell me why, or tell me who, or tell me how, or tell me when. Those are just rephrased questions. But it's tell me about a time when. Tell me about a situation when. And we got to a point in that conversation, I must have asked 2 or 3 story prompts, because you don't need to ask a lot. People, when they tell stories, reveal more than if you ask them a question, which is only information.
Mm-hmm.
And I just looked at him and I said, I'm missing something. And he said, what? I said, you've told me about the developmental changes that need to take place. You've told me about the transitional changes, which is old core processing system out, new core processing system in. I know there's a transformation hidden here within this. Tell me about the transformation that we don't know right now, that seems to be hidden. And his reaction to me was, why should they know? And I knew right there and then I had him. I mean, I knew. And I said, humor me. Test it out on the 3 of us, and then I'll tell you whether or not others need to know. And he said to me, we've grown to the size that we're at right now because we have purchased other credit unions and we changed our charter, but there's nobody else left to buy.
Mm.
And that has grown us to over $1 billion in assets. But my board has an edict, and that edict is that I have to grow, and that took us, by the way, about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been told that in the next 5 years, I have to grow this place from 1 billion to 2 billion in assets. And the project manager said, but there's no one else to buy. You just said that. He said, that's correct. He said, well, then what are we going to do? Like, how do you grow? Like, are you going to build more brick and mortar buildings? What are you going to do? And within the course of like 2 or 3 minutes, the 2 others in the room who were listening to this conversation between the CEO and I said, oh my gosh, there's only one way to go. And that's to sell insurance, sell loans, sell other sorts of products, which credit unions are not tasked to do in the US. It's not part of the overall mission. It's to keep you out of debt. When you start selling loans and other things, you're putting people into debt, consciously putting them into debt. And he said, yes, that's what we're going to do. And I looked at the project manager and I said, was any of that in your original plan? And like, you know, like, do we have processes for sales? No. Do we know what products we're going to sell? No. Do we have people have sales skills? No. Now we got a mindset shift that we have to take care of? Yes. And that one shift changed the entirety of the flavor of the whole core processing transformation, because it presented as a technology transitional change. But every change has developmental, transitional, transformational, and I would add to that perpetual change component. So the CEO looked at me and he said, I have a whole day coming up where it's a holiday here and we still bring in employees and we pay them. And we're going to spend a day, we were going to talk about this new technology. How would I start out the day? And I said, well, in a typical change, if I use a change equation, which is Gleicher's change equation, change is equal to 3 factors being multiplied together: dissatisfaction with the status quo, which is pain and urgency, the vision of the change, and first steps. I said, But there's another thing that's embedded in it. I said, I don't want you presenting stories of pain and urgency. I would, because you've already started to embark on this, and there's a lot of angst around, can we get this done? And this seems bigger, and now we're going to make it bigger. We're going to enlarge the scope because we can't be successful otherwise. The original core processing system change out was because you've got 20 different systems in there. When you bought everybody, you just kind of cobbled them together, but you got this other sales piece to deal with. I said, I want you to, you're going to open the day by telling people that answer the following story prompt. Tell me about a time in your life when you greatly resisted a change, and when you came to embrace it, you found that there were great benefits on the other side. Now, that story prompt provokes people to only think of one, maybe two situations in their life. And that's what story prompts do. They're not like, tell me about your day or tell me about your career. That's like too much stuff. But they force you to think of one situation. And he said, I already have it. I already know what it is. And I said, does anybody in this room know? Does anybody outside this room know? He said, well, the COO who's sitting here has heard pieces of this story, but I think the time is right for me to tell the whole story. And that's what I coached him on. Was that story. And the interesting thing about it was, let me give you kind of like the anecdote of the story. When this man was a child, he vowed to become a school teacher because the education system in his particular locale was horrible. He went on to college, became a teacher, and then couldn't find a job. So he went to work in a private charter school that paid very little money. And one day, a colleague came up to him and started asking him questions. You know, do you do school bus duty to earn a little bit extra money? Do you do lunch duty to learn a little bit extra money? Do you help out at sporting events or dances to learn a little extra money? And my CEO said, yes, I do. And this man said, well, I heard that you were recently married. Congratulations. And he said, thank you. He said, so when are you and your wife planning to have kids, if you don't mind me asking? And he said, well, I told my wife that when we have kids, she can stop working. We plan to have several. And he said, well, this other man said, I'm sorry to tell you that if you allow your wife to stop working and have these children, which is your plan for you as a family, your dream as a family, you're going to be on food stamps because you're never going to be able to make enough money here to support yourself. And my CEO said, no, that's not the life I promised my wife. And he went home that night and he agonized over this whole situation. And he and his wife decided he would go back to school in the evenings for an MBA. But now I want you to imagine, school teacher going to school for his MBA. Now he's got to afford the MBA. So he takes on a job at the same time working in a bank when the cleaning crew comes in at night to collect loans. And he's very successful. And one day the CEO of the bank shows up unannounced. Nobody else ever comes. And he says to him, why are you doing this? How are you so good? Like, what's going on? And he tells him a story. And he says, when you're done with your MBA, you come find me. I think I have a job for you. And so he entered that bank in a very senior management position. But what he realized is he didn't like the values of banking and he liked the values of credit unions. So he eventually came to the credit union where he met me. He had been in a COO role and then had gone into the CEO role. He brought his whistle with him. And his whole, the moral of the story, and let me see if I can remember the words, were something like, if I can do it, you can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. And so I'm challenging all 550 of you. I can do it, you can do it. That audience at the end of that 10-minute story stood up and gave him a standing ovation. Every single speaker for the rest of the day referenced that story. He had his whistle with him from when he was a teacher, so he could blow the whistle when it was break time or whatever, go into different rooms. Mm-hmm. And that transformation was achieving results in less than, it was like 3 months prior to hitting the 5-year mark. And the results were beyond what they had wanted to achieve on the asset level. With one single story about, are we ready? Allow me to mobilize you. But that was me understanding what story needed to be told. However, along the way, I did training. After we did this one day, I would train with all the leaders. And we were teaching them how to do a change impact assessment on their own branch, which is very cool, right? We get them involved at the lowest of levels. And in those sessions, I prompted people to tell stories to each other about pain and urgency. The CEO didn't tell a story of pain and urgency. The people told the story to each other. And in that way, they knew what they needed to start doing within their individual branches. So it's not so much about how do you tell it, but how do you provoke it, and then how do you listen in what we call a listening delightedly manner to actually help people get meaning from that story and move themselves to action.
So first thought, I want to go work at that credit union, but I just, and maybe this is an obvious question, but I think, what is it about story that is so powerful?
Yeah.
Because that was like that, even you retelling the story was very, very powerful. Like, I was sitting in awe. So what is it about story, Lori, that makes it such a catalyst for getting people on board?
That's a really thoughtful question. First, we need to distinguish, because what I gave you was a synopsis of the story, so it was more of the anecdote. It wasn't actually the real story, right? So, but it still was powerful.
Yes.
But for us, and my colleague and I have done a lot of work in this area over time, stories aren't the same as anecdotes or case studies or descriptions or examples. And that's important to know, because most people don't know that a story is its own unique thing. But the human brain, over the history of mankind, has kind of like rewired itself, and it absolutely loves story. It remembers situations and scenarios in the brain as story. It's a whole brain activity. So it's not an analytical activity, it's not a creative activity, it's both woven together. And when the human brain, so it's also a tool of influence, not persuasion. So influence hits us in what Daniel Kahneman calls system 1 in the brain, which is where most of our decisions every day is made, right? The unconscious, emotional, intuitive, fast part of the brain. That's where story connects to. When we go to system 2, which is that part of the brain that's deliberate and slow and effortful, it often moves us to debate. And the brain doesn't want to be there. It takes too much work. It makes me tired. But most communication techniques we teach people are around system 2 techniques. And in fact, that's where data is, which is hugely problematic. So what story does is story caters to the way the brain prefers to hear information. And because its messaging in many ways is unconscious, and I'm not, because people can con artists use story. So there's a dark side to story, right? We're talking about the type of story that has integrity or honor to it.
Let's assume that people are good.
Yeah. Let's assume that people are good.
Yeah.
People, their brain doesn't have to think. They just know what to do. So if you, and it takes a while to craft those stories. So even like with the CEO, I didn't just he didn't just tell his story off the cuff. He told me his story. I actually audio recorded it. I asked him a bunch of questions to get more details. I crafted the first long version of the story, and then he and I polished it so that we could get all the elements in that we need to get into a story to make it a story. Because there's a science to story as well as an art. And then he practiced it. He took his story on a walk. That's how you learn to rememorize your own story and make it natural, such that he could stand in front of an audience with no notes and tell it in the way that he and I had put it together and truly make an impact. And those efforts paid off for him. So but I know types of stories. I know how to structure stories. I mean, there's a lot of that, but the human brain, it doesn't care about some of that. What it loves is sensory information. We call it lots of sensory details, voice, visual, the auditory with the voice, being able to smell something. What are the words to smell something? Or what's it like to touch something? What's it like to feel it emotionally? All those sorts of things. And when you craft a story in that way, the human brain, we have my colleague, Kendall Haven, wrote a book on this in 2007. It was a summary of 350 research studies that proved that story was a more beneficial tool for memory and for retaining details.
Mm-hmm.
So lucky us, right? But you have to know that it's not an anecdote. And you have to know that you kind of don't want to put raw data in a story. You kind of got to know those things, right? Because otherwise you're going to defeat your purpose. And that's what people are still learning. Even though I've been working in this field now of business storytelling since, probably 2002. And my colleague, Karen Dietz, who I've been writing with, was doing this work in the 1970s. It's still new to a lot of people.
When you were talking about the CEO had it written down, and you were he would keep memorizing it and going over and trying to make it his own. It reminds me of that scene from Reservoir Dogs. If anybody's seen it, it's actually Quentin Tarantino's tip of a hat to storytelling, about how you ought to have this story to tell, but you make it your own. And then he would juxtapose the character learning about the story and then telling the story as if it was his own, and then using those words like the scene was he walked into a bathroom where there was all LA police officers, and he had a bag of drugs, and he's like, he didn't just walk in, like he explained, like, and it wasn't real because he was trying to show that he was undercover, but it just hit me with like a tidal wave, and he just used those words that you were saying to invoke a feeling. And so but that's a good way of showing storytelling is so powerful in every way. And so when you have like a president that, in 500-person company and was very personal, how about when there's one where, like, large companies, highly regulated, where, like, does that still work with people that sometimes it's just a job and the person telling the story is trying to move them? Like, is the scenario the same, or do you have to work harder or tell different stories?
Well, that's where this stakeholder assessment for the transformation becomes really key, because there are some leaders that actually don't hold weight with their employees. Like, I worked with a C-suite leader, a CEO of a hospital, who had told the board he was resigning. And the board said, no, we're not going to allow you to resign. You're going to stay an additional year. Well, he didn't want to stay. We had a huge transformation we had to do. Huge, huge. I didn't use him. I didn't tax him with it because it wasn't going to make a difference. What I did was I sat down, with my internal contact and said, who here carries weight? And what we figured out, which was comical, was that the board carried more weight than they were showing, that they had been more of I don't want to say they weren't passive, that's for darn certain, but that they had taken a kind of a back seat because they had trusted this person for so many years and the C-suite was so strong. But I just said, I met one day with the head of the board. And again, it doesn't have to be a person in a line leadership position. It can be someone off to the side. And he said to me the first time I met him, I want you to think about this as a metaphor. He said, hi, and he told me his name, and he said, who are you? And I said, do you want me to tell you who I am like you told me about yourself, or would you like to hear about who I really am? And he said, oh, the second one sounds a whole heck of a lot more interesting. And I said, I'm Mary Poppins. Hi, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Mary Poppins. I've just been asked, I've just kind of floated in for the day with my umbrella. It's sitting in the corner. And he looked at me and he said, how many spoonfuls of sugar did you bring with you? And that's how we started the talk. And I knew I had my guy, right? In other organizations, it's people at the front line level. I kid you not, there are people buried in organizations who are the most amazing, amazing influencers. It's getting them to step up. You know, you have to step up to the table and, you know, let's step up your game. And when you say to them, here's how I'd like you to help us with this transformation. And you're I'm really strategic about this. I mean, I map this stuff out with, you know, people internally, because we have to know what we got different people doing, and we have to understand what they're trying to shift. But this is a very organic process. It's not lockstep, you know. How do we do some story circles with groups of employees to start talking about some of the issues? How do we carry away meaning from those sessions? How do we get people to challenge each other to make changes happen? How do we do that? And it's possible, but you have to know the underbelly of that organization. You kind of got to know who are the movers and shakers. You have to understand the cultural impediments, meaning what fundamental truths exist in the organization that are probably going to stop you in your tracks, and how do you either work around them or ideally get them out of the way, remove those things, because you eventually can over time. And who do you have to talk to about that? Who do you got to go to? You don't just do this it's all not like in a public way. There's like the public side of transformation, and then there's the private side of transformation. And that's the stealth piece. You know, I still have to look busy, even though I'm having conversations with people, because those conversations are what's going to make this shift happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So I'm through a lot of the Lean Six Sigma work I do. I'm also a big fan of leveraging the strength of the front line. What if you have difficulty convincing them to be vulnerable? Because I've been told in the past, you know, you never want to stick your head up too high, because that exposure may end up with your head cut off. So what if you have a hard time actually convincing folks on the front line to tell their story? How would you engage them to get past that?
Well, see, as part of change, let's go back to that change equation. Dissatisfaction, pain, and urgency. People are always going to talk about their pains, and they'll probably have some urgency with them. But there's that middle piece, vision of the change. You have people co-create a vision of what the change will look like when it's done. And it's an actual story. And I have had people engage in those efforts who others have told me will never participate, and they lead the charge. Now, in the ideal sense, you know, everybody's got their own dream story. So, you know, Mike's got his, you've got yours, I've got mine. Let's say it's around a transformation. We can all tell our own dream story. But to co-create a singular vision of the change story, especially for the totality of the transformation, the ideal is you would start at that level first, and then have people either create their own for their groups or insert their pieces into that larger story. In that way, then nobody stands out. And we're collectively working toward this together. And that's what makes this attractive. And if you get people to do, like I've been in organizations where maybe we have 3 transformations going on simultaneous, they're coming out of a strategic planning process. We write stories that actually become skits. And people act them out, and we videotape them. And they're so much fun. Or we have some that become artistic displays. We don't just use the spoken word. There are lots of different ways. And when people get to act out things or bring their creative side to work, you see a very different way of being. You can even do, I documented in a book I wrote in 2006 called Wake Me Up When the Data is Over. It was examples of the use of story across 10 different business functions worldwide. We were at that time trying to figure out if anybody was really doing this stuff. But there was a group of folks, the Ginger group out of Canada, who the way that they would create these stories is they would have painting easels. Like maybe there were 10 people in a group, be an easel set up for each person, and you'd be given painting supplies. and you start to paint the picture of what this transformation looks like for you. And maybe you're given 5 minutes at your easel, and every 5 minutes you switch to a different easel and you paint on someone else's.
Mm.
And by the time you're done, you have 10 paintings that are co-created.
Right.
And it's a way to artistically show how we need to work together. It's great stuff. And when people do that, then they can talk about what was it like? What does it mean? And they're metaphorically talking about the change.
Right.
And then we can relate that to what's going on in the organization.
And that's very similar to an idea out of the Lego serious play discipline, which is this idea of a shared model where everybody builds their individual model, but then you need to combine them or combine elements of them into a shared model that is owned by everybody. And if you've ever been through that process, it ends with everybody telling the story of the shared model so that there is an understanding in each person's own voice of what that model represents to the group. So,
right. And what we add to that then is, but what's the story of what done is? How are people's lives, right?
Right.
A single character's life. How are they going? What's it going to be like 5 years from now when this is implemented?
Right.
So there's a richness that's added to that. So that's taking it to a point. And now I'm saying take it a step farther, because without that collective narrative with a character, I don't have anything. See, what story is a great shorthand. I can say, you know that story about Joe that we wrote? Remember when he's like doing XXX in the story? And then I can ask a question about it. Whereas if I don't have that, I'm still trying to create the collective. We might have a collective thing, but I don't have the narrative, and the brain wants the narrative.
Would you then say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, would you say that most people, as they're going through transformation, end up in sort of a theatrical role, where it's just they're going through the motions and they aren't actually invested in the work that they're doing?
I don't work in those settings.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's fair.
I have walked away once.
Okay.
I will be very honest with you. I have walked away from a situation where I saw that, and I said to the client, it isn't worth you spending any more money, because here's my prediction. I have a gift, and so this is going to sound kind of strange, but my father developed this gift in me. Some people call it intuition, but there's a form of intuition that is very developed called prescience. And in certain situations, I can just see things, and I see them before they happen. And I saw the train wreck happening. I saw people getting laid off, the group that I was working with getting laid off. I saw other things, and I didn't think it was appropriate to take any more resources. So I removed myself, and sure enough, within about a month to 6 weeks, it kind of started to fall apart. And the client thanked me for doing that, because it was their wake-up call to the group about, I think y'all need to find different jobs. I think you need to do other things. This is not going. And it has no fault of your own, because here's what people sometimes don't realize. The things that are playing out in organizations today were not decided today. They were decided 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And you're just the person or group that is going to be impacted by that decision that was made 10 years ago. And if it was a really, really bad decision, there's just about nothing you can do. You can give your very best, but then that's why we have leaders who come in who are turnaround specialists. I did turn around for 10 years. It's really hard work. But the things actions you have to take in turnaround mode are awful actions. They're just awful. I worked in a place, we had 300 people one day and 100 the next. And we spent 24 hours locked in a room trying to figure out how are we going to slash the organization so that we could grow it again. We were actually smart. We didn't just say slash it to get money, but how do we slash it so that we can bring them back and grow? And we did. Within 6 months, we were able to bring them back. But in that moment, we had to slash.
Right.
And, how do we keep them from going elsewhere? How do we make them want to come back? So I think that it's about understanding the business of the business. How do organizations strategically operate? Because if you know that, then you can start to figure out what was that decision that's impacting us now? And do we have a chance of making this work?
Right.
But most organizations, quite to me, the hard part is they, if they're successful, they are at risk because mediocrity sets in. I mean, we're successful. We don't need to do any more. I've had a lot of clients like that, and I predict that in 10 years they won't be around. And unfortunately, it's usually 10 to 11 years they're not. The best places for transformation are when people are in great pain because they're motivated to do something different.
So I guess your question, Vince, we tout the 83% failure rate.
Mm-hmm.
Your answer would be that. The people that are
Yeah.
just going through the motions are those 83% of the transformations that fail.
Yeah. Which I think at
Yeah.
this point in the 9 or 10 episodes that we've done, we have probably uncovered 3 or 4 different variables that contribute to that 84% outside of just what's reported. We've talked about people, we've talked about process, we've talked about now lack of commitment, lack of a shared vision and shared story, going through the motions. Like there's all these things that are contributing to that excessively high failure rate.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to not be in that group, if you want to be in the 14% or the 16%, whatever it is, then you've got to have these elements, because it's how you're going to coalesce people that are not only involved directly in the transformation, but also that are going to be impacted by it, and will have to buy into that change and that transformation to get them on board for that, shared vision. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting.
No.
If you do a change impact assessment, you're going to know before you ever really get started, if you do one up front, whether or not you have any success.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to literally be able to retool. And that's why I think a lot of the initiatives that I've been involved in, even when I've come in, mostly like when things are failing, because we retool, we're able to regroup. And I think that one of the big gaps is that we don't do that front end work.
Yes.
And if we did it, and it is not right now. Oh my gosh, the number of people I have interviewed who are doing digital transformation, data analytics adoption, everybody says to me, "Oh yes, we are doing it, Lori." Really? Tell me what you're doing. I just got another LinkedIn private message about this the other day. Well, we got a named sponsor, we got training, and we got a communications plan.
Yep.
And I'm like, yeah, so? Where's your change impact assessment?
So it goes back to, when you do transformation properly, it's a lot of work. And it's not just buying a piece of technology. Like, look at all the things that we've just talked about today that have nothing to do with technology. And so when it's touted that here's a transformational product that you just have to come in and install and you're off and running, goes back to what Lori's been saying the whole time.
Well, and you've also given me some food for thought, Lori, because I thought I was doing a good thing by touting the need for change management, because in project management there's this manage change sort of thought of, but it's about managing the technology change. And so you and I speak at a lot of the same conferences. I've told that audience, if you don't have any sort of formal or informal training in change, like people and process change, go get it. But I'm realizing through this conversation that even that isn't sufficient, because it's once the project starts, and it's not in the pre-work. And so I'm gonna have an evening of imposter syndrome where I feel like I'm a failure, and I'm just kidding. But I was halfway there, and I think you've said that a couple times. Like, you're taking it here, now you need to go one step further, and that's powerful.
Can I give you a success story with that in mind?
Please.
Yeah. So I a couple of years ago, this is a government agency. I was working with the head of technology. So call him a CIO. And he came to me. I've known him for many years. We've done projects over time. But he came to me and he said, I've just inherited a huge group of people from 2 other agencies. We really need to rethink strategically what we do. And I could do a traditional strategic plan, or I could just say, let's approach this like Lori approaches change, and let's do a change impact assessment up front, and let's see what that gets us. And so he, with a few of his colleagues, his peers at his level, who he reported to, because he reported in through an executive who reported into the C-suite. 4 or 5 of them put together a vision story for if technology was where it really ideally needed to be in the future, not naming any types of technology, what would the life of a mid-level manager look like? And we wrote a story about this. It's about 4 or 5 pages long. We then put together a team of 20 people in the organization, what I call a max mix group, people from all different levels, all different areas, you know, even someone, they don't have a union, but someone who like there's an employee representation committee, things like that. And we said, could you give us 2 days of your time? And we did a organizational architecture assessment. We showed them the vision story, and we backed out of it a whole bunch of things. We backed out of it. What is it? This philosophically telling us is the way the tech group needs to act. Like we call them design principles. If we had to redesign the technology group in terms of a set of principles, how would they act? Like, is it, 12-hour response time, or how would they behave with other people? Those sorts of things. Then we backed out. We said, what projects? We created this huge chart. I was just looking at it the other day. What are the precursor projects for this vision to come true? What projects would actually have to be done, and in what order would they have to happen? But then we, within that chart, talked about what could stop us. What are the issues we need to overcome? Some traditional things on resourcing, whatever. And then when the 2 days was finished, he and I took this information, we summarized it, but we only did the following. We took the story, because the story got a little bit massaged along the way. And we only took the story to all of the leaders in the organization, about 40 of them. We gave it to them 1 day in advance of meeting one-on-one. And when they came in the room, we just said, what'd you think? What'd you like about the story? What's your reaction to it? And they all told us, and here's the comedy. None of them really like technology. None of them want to make investments in technology. And every one of them told us we didn't think big enough. Like they wanted more. So we're like, cool, we rewrote the story, we put it all together, and we said, does this now match what you want? After we aggregated their comments. Yep, this is exactly what we want. Well, this is what you want, then here are the 9 projects, which we also had to tweak a little bit.
Right.
I said, okay, cool. Every single one of those projects happened. Every single one was successful. Every single one. Only one got delayed a little bit because we realized something else had to get done before the other. Every single one. And there were still people saying, oh yeah, what about this? But then we'd come back, do you want this story? Is this what you want? Yes, that's right. That's what I want. Thank you for reminding me. Yep, that's what I want. Go do your stuff. So it was a very different way of approaching traditional work, but that was someone who actually I did get to work at the front end, and I'm very grateful. And he is too, it elevated him in the organization. He got a promotion.
Right.
I think Vince is like flabbergasted. So the telling the story, I think that's an awesome approach, because it gets away from the what about, what did you think of, how about this thing you haven't added? Is this what you want? Is this the story you're looking for? Is this the journey we want to sell? Like whatever it is, like telling the big story and saying, is this what you want? Then all the little detail and spin goes away, because they've agreed to that's what I want, which inherent comes with all these other things. And so I think that's a great way, especially in highly regulated industries and maybe government, is a great way to embark on embark on any type of change.
Yeah.
Is to sell the big story, and then the chatter would go away. I think leaving on a positive high note of story, especially in government, would be a great place.
Yeah, I was actually thinking like, Lori, I could talk to you for another hour and a half and beyond, but I want to be respectful of your time as well. We've already gone way over, but this has been amazingly valuable. Can we ask you to come back at some point in the future?
Oh, absolutely. Would love to.
You're the best. You're the best.
Thank you.
And where can people find
Oh, yes.
you?
Oh, they can
Most
find
importantly,
the best place to find me right now is on LinkedIn.
Oh,
That's
okay.
where I do all of my conversations and communications. So come and connect to me on LinkedIn. On YouTube, my Level Up with Lori shows that I have, which are LinkedIn Live shows, are in a playlist called Level Up with Lori. Once you find me on LinkedIn, you will get notifications when the shows go live, and you can always go and look at the ones that Vince was even saying, that he's seen live, but that have been recorded now and are archived for us. I look at them myself because I find so much value in what my guests are sharing with me.
Yeah, I was actually very disappointed to miss yesterday's, but I had a meeting, and I still had my pop up like, Level Up with Lori is live now. You may want to click it. I can't. I'm in another meeting. So it's insanely valuable, and I cannot thank you enough for being on the Business Not as Usual podcast. Lori, you are the best.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
it was a real honor, Lori.
Yeah,
It was awesome.
Thank you.
okay.